Gives me great pleasure to introduce Michael Doyle, who is the director of the Columbia Global Policy Initiative. He's a university professor at Columbia University, and now get this, in the School of International and Public Affairs, Columbia Law School, and Political Science. And he is a renowned international relations scholar. His book, Empires, which had a deep influence on me and my understanding of things like the Soviet Empire, maybe not necessarily what you were thinking about in terms of that, but it was very helpful to me. The Ways of War and Peace, which is a part of our field seminar for our PhD students at UAlbany. And striking first, Preemption and Prevention in International Conflict, among other books. He has served as a member of the External Research Advisory Committee of the UNHCR and also the Advisory Committee on Lessons Learned Unit of the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. So a bit we were talking about before, we'll talk a bit more. But in 2001 and for 2 years, 2003, he served as the Assistant Secretary General for Policy Planning and Special Advisor to UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. And it's, again, I think this is where we're going to hear a little bit from Michael in terms of the ways in which academics and policymakers interact in that particular context in his work with special focus on the development of the Millennium Development Goals.
Great. Thank you very much, Ray, for that kind introduction. I've known Ray for many years, and he's now guiding me back into studies of migration. He's given us a great deal of help, at least, and he's sort of serving as my tutor when I'm trying to re-gear up on some issues that I haven't looked at for more than 10 years. So it's a great pleasure to see you. He didn't also mention that the other connection I have is I regard myself as a genuine member of the North Country. I've been coming to the Adirondacks for 40 plus years, every summer and every winter, so I regard it as a place where I recharge my batteries. So it's great to be so close to a part of the world that I really love. So thank you very much for that. I don't want to make this too academic. For me, it's a constant temptation. But I would like to pass you a handout. Having a handout at lunch sounds horrible. So you have my apologies in advance. It's some material from the Millennium Declaration and the MDGs. The MDGs have been, I think, a very positive force, but they're also controversial. There's a lot of misinformation about them. And so I'd like to give you my own version. And this is the right time. Within a couple of days, the SPGs will be endorsed down in New York. A major effort to have goals for the next 15 years. They were a very impressive outcome. The PRs of Kenya and Hungary did a very good job steering through the open working group to produce these. They've produced a little bit of a monster. They got 17 goals, 169 targets, and I don't know how many indicators will be associated with them. So it's quite an elephant that they've established. It has the virtue of being soup to nuts comprehensive. A whole lot of participation has been involved in it, and those are real virtues. Because getting to the MDGs, some of the criticisms that have been made of the MDGs are that they were just done by a bunch of experts, and civil society was excluded, that the least developed countries, the less developing countries didn't have adequate voice in the MDGs, that they're all one size fits all, top down. These three criticisms are very prevalent, and in my own opinion, they're all wrong, and I'll tell you why, at least why I think they're wrong. On the other hand, the MDGs have been criticized for being too narrow, focused just on development, not human rights, violence protection, inequality, migration. I spoke at the UN a couple times on why we left migration out. They're weak on sustainability. Okay, it's the second criticism of them. And the third is that they needed a lot more coherence between the global and the national. And in my opinion, all those last three criticisms are exactly right. They're true. And I'll elaborate on that a little bit too. My plan today in about 20 minutes is to put the MDGs in context. It's the context of politics. You know, I'm an academic, but what I was doing was not social science or anything technical or anything having to do with scholarship. The role that I played and that many staff people play working for a Secretary General who was as ambitious and brilliant as my boss, Kofi Annan, was very political. It's a political institution, and my job was distinctly political. My job was to mobilize sufficient political support to politically endorse and thus multilaterally legitimize the technical development consensus that made the most politically viable sense. So you heard political a lot in the part of the sentence. And that's what I was doing. I was surrounded by a really superb team of experts on development. And my job was to make sure that what we did was something that could be endorsed by the General Assembly once we were done. So it was that kind of tailoring back and forth was what I had to do. So my brief remarks are, what does the UN do? What happens when norms are being created? Because the MDGs are a set of norms. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the, inside the ballpark, inside the beltway look at putting together the MDGs. First of all, to radically simplify, and in this group, this is not necessary, there are 3 UNs that we talk about. There's the operational UN that does peacekeeping and humanitarian. There's the convening and conferencing UN. For the United States, it's not very important, but for many of the 193 members, this is their one place in the world to be treated as a sovereign equal and to be heard, to participate, as that wonderful new Broadway musical Hamilton says, to be in the room. It's a truly great tune that I recommend to everyone. That's it. So it's the convening UN. And then the third UN is the normative UN. And this is what I'll be focusing on. It's the UN's normative record is very impressive. It begins with human rights. We call it the Universal Declaration of Human Rights because it was a declaration that went through the General Assembly. It was passed unanimously by the General Assembly. And then, as we know, development, the understanding of development, national development, sustainable development, climate change, all of these have a UN connection to them that's been a very important part of the institution. So where does the normative legitimacy come from for these? Well, we say 2 things, or maybe 3. One, of course, is legal. The UN Charter, by Article 103, is the top dog international treaty. No treaty can conflict with it and supersede it the way a normal treaty can supersede a previous treaty. And that's very important. So there's a lot of legal empowering there, mostly in peace and security, but still across a large area, the UN treaty, the Charter, is declared to be the premier document. So it has a legal status to it that's important. Even more important, of course, is participation. It's where 193 member states all come together, and then large numbers of civil society organizations supplement that. So there's a great deal of deliberative dialogue and legitimacy structure comes from that. And then there are other sources, expertise. When we get to demography, I think that we would agree that the UN has been very good in terms of high-quality demographers, for example. And we could point to other areas. Our friend Joe Shamey is being just one example of it, where expertise has been brought to bear in development in certain areas as well. And then, of course, sometimes when you've got a boss like mine, charisma, the current leader's a little charisma challenged. He has other virtues, but my boss had real charisma. A room would light up when he walked into him. We used to call him the secular pope. And we now have a real pope who has a lot of charisma attached to him, but Kofi certainly had it. When we talk about norms in political science and law, we often draw a distinction between hard and soft. Hard and soft law, hard and soft norms. A hard law, this is Ken Abbott and Duncan Snyder did a very good article a number of years ago that developed this. A hard law or a hard norm has a lot of obligatory character to it. It's precise or it's delegated. A soft law or a soft norm is one with little obligation attached to it. It's a recommendation, let us say. It's imprecise or it's not delegated. So capital O, capital P, capital D is their designation for hard law, small letters for soft. A treaty, for example, that's gone through the Article 6 process of the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And if it's self-executing, it holds right there. We don't believe in self-executing treaties anymore, but it's in the law that they could be. And so that produces powerful, hard legitimacy. To get at the concept a little bit more, think, for example, if we said to each other, let's improve the local community because I think it's a good thing to do, and we will plan on doing something worthwhile in the near future. Okay? Now that's very soft. It's not a strong obligation, it's not very precise, and it's not delegated. Imagine we said to each other at the same time, okay, we need to improve the local community. Why don't we all show up on Saturday to build a playground, okay? And we're going to delegate to Jones the organizing of the various tasks, and we're going to write a bond for $500 each in case we don't show up, okay? Obligatory, precise, and delegated. So what I'd like to talk about briefly here on the MDGs is how a very soft General Assembly resolution, the Millennium Declaration, which is full of rather hortatory kind of language and big lovely sentiments from peace and security to human rights to humanitarian protection to development, to the future of Africa, reforming the UN, everything got in it. But it was all large rhetorical clouds, became something when the MDGs were done that was a little bit like supranational legislation for some countries. So what was this process of hardening? And that's what the MDGs were all about. The first step was something called the Delegation for the Roadmap. And this was General Assembly Resolution 55/162. When you're a bureaucrat, you remember that kind of stuff. And that delegated to the Secretary General the obligation to prepare a roadmap report on how to implement this declaration that went through unanimously through the General Assembly. That was the first authorization to move ahead. And this declaration was signed at a summit in September of 2000. Some of the key elements of it was an attempt by the Secretary General to urge the institution to rethink its identity from we the states to a we the peoples orientation. So it was designed to put people first and to focus in on how human rights, development, humanitarian protection, environmental protection, and the others would make the UN relevant again for real people who needed its assistance. That was what the whole idea about. Within it, there was one chapter, the development chapter, that was distinctive because it had some hard targets, or at least hard target-looking things in it. There were 14 of them. The rest of the chapters were fuzzier. And so what the Secretary General did when I came to work for him, he handed me the Millennium Declaration, and he says, figure out how to implement all of this, develop a strategy to implement peace, security, human rights, humanitarian development, future of Africa, and reform of the UN by September. And so my staff at that time included 3 people, okay? And of course, you mobilized the system, but it was soon obvious that was impossible. I'll tell you some stories on areas we tried on human rights. But on the other hand, on development, we had something more to work with, because in here were 14 goal-targeting kinds of things that were confirmed. And we had some good leadership in UNDP that wanted to do something with it. And so UNDP approached me to help make at least the development part real. And so beginning in April, I assembled a team with the help of Jan van der Meulen, I don't know if you know him, a very good senior development specialist in UNDP. And he and I put together a team from UNICEF, the World Bank, OECD, UNFPA, WHO, a whole panoply. And typically it was either the top development professional, a PhD in economics usually, or the top statistician of each of these institutions. And we started meeting in the basement of the building to say, how can we get something that's implementable, that has concrete, doable commitments attached to it, that will give us an opportunity to monitor the fulfillment of the Millennium Declaration, at least in the development side. Well, eventually we wound up with 8 goals, 18 targets, 48 indicators. They're in your handout in the back on the last page. All of us agreed to it. We got the full agreement of the World Bank, the UNDP, the IMF, not OECD, I can tell you why. And we issued these little statements here. This is the World Bank card that was issued in September of the following year. It was nicely built to carry around. In the UN, Colleen will appreciate this, we figured we wanted to have something that was easy to carry around, of course. And this, of course, would naturally it because it fits in your breast pocket, right? How many women's suits have breast pockets? Anyway, it does fit in a male's breast pocket very easily, but that just shows you the culture that we're working with. So, and we then managed to issue that in September of 2001. I wasn't able to get an endorsement from the General Assembly, but I did get a takes note of, which is sort of the second level down, and nobody blocked it, which could have happened. And I'll tell you how we got there. So where does the MDGs come from? If you take a look at your handout, it comes from the development chapter, which you've got in front of you, and the first bit of the common environment section. And basically, when we got together in the basement, we decided that we had things that we could extract from both of those that looked to be ones that could be monitored and form part of a strategy. And we just decided to focus there. But the real authority for everything that we're doing is the Millennium Declaration. And why that was authority for us, and this is a consensus document, every member of the UN was persuaded to sign on to this, okay, without dissent. It doesn't mean everybody likes every bit of it. You know how these things work. But they were prepared to regard this as a consensus document, and it was welcomed in one of these big photo ops. All the heads of state and government all showed up. They lined up for a big picture, and they endorsed this document. So it was our Bible. It was, we needed, in order to have authority, to draw from that, because we could say that all the member states had already agreed to it. That's the first source, and that's very important. That said, they're not identical. If you look at the Millennium Declaration and look at the MDGs back on the last page, you'll note that they don't look the same at all. If you look in those chapters, you'll find 14 bulleted targets. Instead, we picked 8 goals, okay, and 18 targets. Everything in the MDGs can be found in the Millennium Declaration. And I've had to provenance that like it's a Rubens painting dealing with colleagues in Washington who disputed that. So I had to show them where everything came from because they didn't believe it. But it's not the same. There are 8 goals, even though there are 14 things in the Millennium Declaration that look like they have equal priority. So we chose 8, okay? More importantly, the goals and the targets had to be made much more specific. They had to be crystallized into actionable, measurable, doable targets and goals. And so the language all had to be tweaked. But everything you can find in the Millennium Declaration, it's all there, all the goals and targets, you can be able to trace to that. We didn't make up anything. That's number one. Number 2, the second source was on the second page of the handout, the IDGs, the International Development Goals. These were a set of goals established a few years before by the OECD, the World Bank, and the IMF. Okay. drawing upon all of the commitments made in the 1990s at the big summits and conferences, not as we did indirectly, of course. And Secretary General Kofi Annan signed on to it as well, but it produced a storm of controversy. The moment it was released, it was denounced rather than Better World for All, that's the name of the report, as Bretton Woods for All. This was denounced by developing countries, and especially by the NGOs who claimed to speak for them. So the Secretary General was embarrassed by this. And the reason being that this is very paternalistic. It's the rich countries monitoring how well the poor countries are doing, okay, with no commitment on their own. And so it was pretty toxic by the time that this process with the MDGs started. There was a brief request that came from, I won't mention where, to name the, what we later called the MDGs, the International Development Goals in the Millennium Declaration. But we immediately nixed that because we needed to walk away from the toxicity of the IDGs. But you will notice they look very similar to the MDGs. So that's the next part of the story. And then, of course, the third orange is bureaucratic. It's cutting deals amongst these senior officials from the bank, the IMF, and elsewhere. And there are some parts of the MDGs that are only there because we just had to keep the bank, World Bank on board, or UNICEF, and some makes no sense. You know, the poverty ratio that the World Bank likes, the poverty gap ratio, is totally untransparent. I remember back in September 2001, the night before I did the press announcement of all of this, memorizing again and again until I got it right, the definition of the poverty gap ratio, because it has no intuitive sense to it whatsoever, but the bank insisted upon it, and I knew some journalist was going to ask me what it was. Frankly, I've suppressed it completely. Let everybody do the same. But so it's bureaucratic dealing took place. So we met over the summer, but my real job was political. As I mentioned, these are really first-rate development experts in the room, bringing all of their expertise to bear on what was the best possible way to measure these various goals and targets that we were putting there. But what I was doing was making sure that when we were done, a vote could be assembled to support it. So what I did mostly was shoe leather, walking around the ideas as they were developing to some key delegations. And there were two delegations that were, well, there were three, but two that were really positively key for us. The first was the European Union. It's where the money is. The OECD, in general, of course, was the rich club, but the European Union had an ownership of the IDGs. This had been developed by Claire Short, the development minister from the UK. It was her baby, so to speak, and no sooner was it born than it was trashed by people with whom she had been associated, the development community. So she was very upset. So the first arrangement was that I would do my best to rescue the IDGs and draw parts of them into what would be the MDGs, so that a lot of that would carry over. And you can see, we borrow language, we borrow many of the goals, some of the indicators, some of the targets. And with that, the UK always had my back. Whenever I ran into any difficulty, I could call up Jeremy Greenfield, and he would be there to back me up. And that was very, very important, dealing with some recalcitrant groups. And second of all, they had to be there. That's where the money is. The Europeans and the OECD have the money. If they're not on board for these goals, they're not going to be workable. The second key constituency was the G77. That's 130 votes. You can't do anything in development if they weren't on board. And remember, they had just rejected the IDGs, just about unanimously. So I started having breakfast with the leadership of the G77 to figure out what we could do to bring them back on board. And the most important thing we needed to do, was very clear, was to create something we later called the partnership goal, so that there would be commitment from the wealthy countries to the poorer countries that development wasn't just something the poor countries did, but was a global partnership between the rich and the poor together to make the world a better place. So the partnership goal was written in these breakfasts with the G77. That was extremely important. Without it, nothing could have gone through. That's the nice part of the story. There are other difficulties with it. You will notice reproductive health is a key part in Goal 6 of the MDGs, but it's not in the Millennium Declaration.
Yeah.
I could tell you stories about the headaches that caused down the road. And you might well ask why, okay? Well, the first answer is it's not in the Millennium Declaration. It couldn't make it into that document. The second answer is I tried to squeeze it back in, and when I was meeting with the G77, I said, could we sort of work it back in sort of as a target a little bit, you know? Because I found a little place later in the Declaration where there's a reference to a treaty, and even though it's not mentioned in that treaty, there is some reproductive health. And they said no. And I said, there's no way that the Catholic countries and the Islamic countries will tolerate this. And at the same time, there's another country that would not tolerate that, and that was the United States. And it shifted from Clinton to Bush in the spring of 2001. And that would be a bridge too far. Because the third country I was talking to was the Americans, very quietly. There was no ambassador in New York at this time. The Bush administration hadn't got around to it. We didn't appoint an ambassador until after 9/11. But talking to them, it was very clear, and this was a superb professional. He was warning me, look, the vibes in Washington are extremely hostile to the UN. They're very hostile to what you're doing. The administration is going to launch something called the Millennium Challenge account. And the idea of it is to sweep aside 40 years of development-oriented foreign aid and all these other kinds of things. And here you're talking about reviving this idea of a partnership. And that's not how they regard the development. Development for them is it's the responsibility of the poor country, and if they get their act together with a balanced budget, a very clear privatization agenda, all the rest of it, then we'll provide aid. That was the Millennium Challenge strategy. Very different in that appearance. So there's a lot of hostility coming from Washington, and we had to work around that. And one way that we worked around with it, I promised them, no, there will not be reproductive health in the MDGs. And that helped. And what I got was the following arrangement. That is that the mission would not send what I was doing down to Washington. Okay? They would just treat it as really low-level stuff. And in return for which we would produce a document that wouldn't be absolutely intolerable to Washington. And so it was not, the alternative was to send it down there and get Washington's approval. But I was warned that Washington would kill it. And the US government would then phone up other partners in the OECD and insist that this be closed down. So we went under the radar, and that produced problems down the road. So reproductive health is not in there, but on the other hand, my colleagues at UNFPA, UNICEF, UNIFEM, all the rest were just outraged that what the OECD could agree to, the UN could not agree to. And the second problem was brought up by our colleagues in DESA, is that unless these indicators are endorsed in Millennium Development Goals, they're going to drop from Class A to Class B statistics. Class A statistics, everybody has to report on. Class B statistics are discretionary, which meant that the rate of contraception prevalence would move from Class A to Class B. And all of the agenda from Cairo on of encouraging contraception would be lost. So it was a serious problem. We had to do something about that. And I came up, because I'm not bragging here just a moment, with the idea, why don't we put it in the HIV/AIDS goal? We'll put contraceptive prevalence rate as an indicator for HIV/AIDS, which means it'll stay as a Class A statistic. So people who are monitoring reproductive rights will still be able to get the data that they need globally. So I thought that was just a great idea. And this is an instance of doing stuff that you're not an expert on. So I put the contraceptive prevalence rate as an indicator of progress on HIV/AIDS, okay? And it's in there if you take a look in the MDGs. So the day after we had this lovely celebration announcing the MDGs, I came into my office, I had a message from my assistant. The Director General of WHO insists upon speaking to you immediately. Okay, so I pick up the phone, I hear her shouting. And it eventually comes down to the message, Michael, do you know how many millions of dollars I've spent trying to persuade the world that birth control does not protect you from HIV/AIDS? And so it was very awkward at my end of the phone to say that I've just said that the contraception prevalence rate is an indicator of progress on HIV/AIDS. So we had to walk that back in later versions of the MDGs to the condom use rate within the contraception prevalence rate indicator. A small little detail. I'm stopping just a second. Then the flip side to that was when I was presenting this to Kofi Annan, the revision that needed to take place. He said to me, Michael, you mean I'm going to have to go around Africa and explain to every African head of state how important it is to be using condoms? And I said, yes, Secretary General, you do. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up because I've been going on so long. Let me just finish one last place. What happened in this process then is that because this soft declaration was delegated to a group of officials to make more precise, it was therefore made harder. That is, the P in precision was moved from lowercase to uppercase. That makes it more obligatory in the Abbott-Snidel sense. And even more importantly, this was then adopted by the World Bank, UNDP, the IMF, as standards that go into the PRSPs, Poverty Reduction Strategy papers, that governments that are receiving aid from the multilateral institutions have to report on every year. So this suddenly has now become the report card for all countries that are dependent on multilateral development assistance. So it goes from a soft recommendation to precision by the route of delegation to the specialist to then something that is quasi-legislative for many poor countries who are dependent upon multilateral aid. And that's the way the politics of this worked out. So let me just stop by saying, back to the criticisms. Was this just a bunch of experts run amok, as Ambassador Bolton said? No. The Millennium Declaration was our Bible. And that was agreed to by all the member states. Civil society was closed out. I invited civil society to send us ideas for the roadmap report. I received yay thick stuff, worked like the Dickens, wrote a roadmap report that was about this thick. It's a book. I now have just about the only copy. When I brought it to the Secretary General, the Deputy Secretary General says, no, we can't go through that whole thing again. It's just too much. And so I had to boil the roadmap report down to, I brought a copy of it with me. Many of you have seen them. They float around. This thing right here, much thinner, and it reads like a phone book. It is really dull, and it's had no impact other than the MDGs. So, but it was not just the experts. The states controlled it, and they insisted upon controlling it. There was no option. The LDCs did have a voice. It had Goal 8 was completely written by the G77 at these breakfasts, and they insisted upon no reproductive rights. So they got both of those things in there. It is a global set of goals, so there's one-size-fits-all element to it, and it was designed to be global to inspire a global effort of mobilizing foreign aid. And at the Glen Eagles Summit, it had some of that good effect of kicking up foreign aid and other forms of assistance. But it was always anticipated that countries would write their own MDG goals at the national level and modify it, which they've done. So let me stop there. With regard to the other criticism, yes, indeed, much too narrow. We never got to human rights. We never had sustainability other than in a trivial way. There are a couple things we took out of the declaration. And the coherence still needs a lot of work. And my word to Amino Mohammed and everybody else who's been working hard with the SPGs, I hope you've done better, and that certainly needs to be done better. I apologize for rattling on so long.
Thank you very much. Now we open up for questions or comments. David.
I don't think I can ask it. This was really fascinating. I don't think I can ask this question correctly. But let me try. because you've touched on a whole bunch of things. I'm thinking about the nature of bureaucratic politics. You know Michael Glennon's book, Security and Government?
Mhm.
He and I were talking about that a lot. And in it, he argues that the continuity between the Obama administration and the prior administrations in security politics is due to the fact that policy in complex situations is made by bureaucrats, right? And so he goes back to Raja's notion of two governments of England in the 19th century, right? So I'm thinking here, how do you think about bureaucracy as law, which you did completely uncritically here, besides a couple of substantive things, I think we got this right, got this wrong, but as process, right? At the end, you're very correct, I think, in increasing the precision, you increase the jurisgenerative quality of what's going on. And you do so in a way that really, in almost European Union fashion, escapes the vox populi, right? Right, and so then it's really weird when you start out at the beginning talking about charisma, because every now and then I go to church, and in the Episcopal Church, they frequently stand up and say, we support the Millennium Development Goals. And I kind of hear it like, I support inflation targeting. I mean, it's cool and it's kind of technical, but I'm having a hard time getting that lift out of it, right? So when Weber talks about charisma as necessary, or in all sorts of political situations now in Europe and the Middle East and elsewhere, there's always something a little surreal about listening to an account even as wittily as yours is, right? And anyway, I'll stop. I think it's enough.
But you hit upon a problem that's not just here. I think
No, it's in the
fundamental
nature
to the
of
modern
beast.
state. So much of what rules our lives are decided not by our legislators in Washington or representatives in New York. They write legislation, or the UN does, declarations that are not implementable until they're much further defined and refined. And that's all done by officials and experts. And that applies here in the US as well. So much of what shapes our everyday life is coming out of the commissions, the regulatory bodies, and it's loosely constrained by legislation, but not very tightly. And the details are often quite significant. It's the world we live in. Now, every once in a while, the owners of democratic accountability step back in. 15 years later, they had another shot this summer, and they produced the SPGs. And every once in a while, our legislators will step back in and rewrite a law because the implementation has gone in a strange direction. But when we all teach public policy, we really have to have our students engaged with the fact that the kind of government we have is a mix and balance between an official government of experts and a government of accountable legislators. Not, we don't live in a direct democracy, even a representative democracy. They don't rule with those laws. It only sets a framework for the rules that govern us. And the EU, of course, is the most notorious case of it for our friends here. So I agree 100%.
Thank you.
I've got a question. So what was fascinating is your discussion of sizing up the situation as being political in your practice of politics, all right? So in terms of your practice of politics, what was more important, your study of political science or your experience at places like Princeton University running a center and dealing with university bureaucracies, et cetera? So I'm just wondering here,
It's a really good question. But you see, I guess the answer is there's almost nothing that I brought from being a political scientist that was directly relevant to what I was doing. And the irony...
Wait a second, turn that off.
I'm going to walk that back in just a moment. The reason being that I've been a specialist on peacekeeping. The DPKO told me the moment that I came in, we don't want you messing around with peacekeeping, that's us, okay? You're doing other things with the Secretary General, so no peacekeeping. I used to know something a little bit about refugees when I was working with Madame Ogata, but that, of course, was not my mandate either. So I was dealing with stuff that I hadn't taught since I had been a graduate student of development and political economy. But what you do bring into bear as an academic is the ability to gobble up information, make it coherent, explain it clearly to people, write. All of these things are relevant and useful. But that's in my job, because I was a political advisor to the Secretary General. All the people I had in the room for the MDGs, these were serious, high-quality statisticians, development experts, who brought all of their expertise to bear on how you measure clean water and what's the best way to do so. And that required high levels of competence in the room that I was basically dependent upon in what we were doing. And so there is a real transfer of expertise, but it's not necessarily at the purely political level that I was operating at right there.
Colleen?
Michael, who might challenge you on your own career path, but I'm struck by what you said, because my first introduction to you is as an institutionalist, as somebody who fundamentally believes in institutions. So when you talk about the US government or Ambassador Bolton or others who have a very different view of how states cooperate and how people should cooperate, your view, Kofi Annan's view, it was the opposite. And so did that also, in that digging deep into your IR background?
There is something to that. That is that, my predecessor was John Ruggie. I know some of you know he was the dean of SEPA for many years, very good. He called himself a quasi-constructivist political scientist. And my successor was my former student, a young man named Bob Orr, who's a very good scholar as well, though he's mostly been working in Washington. And he's now the new dean of the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, so he's back on the academic side. And we're all of a sort. Kofi Annan did not recruit, never had John Mearsheimer on his short list as a senior advisor. I greatly admire John. He's a good friend. He's a superb scholar who would not have fit in. There's no question about it. So there is an element of selection that takes place for people like John Ruggie and myself and others in this kind of work. There's no question about that. But it's not as if I could take my institutionalism, other than part of the DNA commitment to cooperation, and use it in any particular way. Not that I was aware of, at least. That didn't happen. David?
I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much. And from your comments, I assume that you're quite interested in human rights and governance issues. I know the World Bank has put a lot of effort into developing governance indicators. So, and the Declaration talks about these things. How come they don't get in?
Yeah. That's a good question. Why is this just development? Okay, partly it's the ridiculous notion that three of us as a staff with the UN could put together a roadmap to take development, human rights, peace and security, humanitarian protection, Africa, the UN itself, and reshape it in that part. That was just impossible. But we did make some efforts. So I don't know whether Colleen's heard this before, but I said, why don't we have some MRGs to complement the MDGs, Millennium Rights Goals. So, and the human rights chapter is not bad. It also includes migration. That's where it was relevant. And so I sat down and with a couple colleagues tried to prepare and draw out some human rights commitments that might be monitorable in the Declaration. And then I said, how would we measure them? And I did draw upon some political science. We have all sorts of, GER scales and other scales to deal with these kinds of issues. But then I contacted Mary Robinson at the High Commissioner's office in Geneva, and I told her what I was about to do. And she is an Irish lady with a big temper. And she let me know that there was no way that I was going to do that. You're not going to take a bunch of academic indicators and start measuring government performance, okay? Because the international system had not agreed upon indicators for human rights, for democracy, for many other things. And so you were not in an official capacity going to be able to do that. And so we closed that down. But, it was something that arguably we should have been doing, given the mandate in our hands from the GA resolution, to develop a roadmap and monitor not just the development side, but the entire declaration. And that's never been done.
you know, we've run over a bit.
I'm sorry for-
No, it's fine, but here's what we're just gonna take some time from the next session. So Ilgu, then we can take one more question and then take a little break so people can get coffee and whatnot, and then start the next session. Please, Ilgu.
I was just gonna say that I was heartened actually looking at the new SDGs, that goal 16 is one that's so near and dear to my heart, where we're talking about transparency and governance, right? And that was like a huge negotiation. Governments really did not want it. Governments are very, very protective of being judged about their own performance, right? They're okay if they're judged on health indicators, they're okay if they're judged on gender indicators, but they're not going to be judged by their own performance. And I think that this is something, the negotiation was whether this would be framed in terms of democracy, but of course that was a big no-no for a lot. So the good governance and transparency kind of is ways of sneaking in some of this discussion about representative government and maybe building institutions that are transparent enough that they can respond to the interests of the people in the rest of the goals, because we ultimately give it to the states as their responsibility to make sure that the rest of the goals are fulfilled. And how are they going to do it unless they fulfill number 16?
Do they have indicators for that?
Yeah, it's number 16. The indicators, the sub-indicators, probably not. It's just they do have indicators for. They do have descriptions of it, and part of it has to do with, they talk about corruption, which was very surprising to me that the term corruption was used there, and they do talk about transparency. The term transparency is in there, and that can be parlayed into many different things. I'm not sure how well they will do it. I mean, they haven't done it well with the poverty, even like the most basic indicator. I'm not sure how they will do it with those vague terminologies, so. Yeah.
Colleen, you had a
I was just going
last question.
to, a very, very quick anecdote, because Michael brought up a point about, well, this suggestion to have the contraceptives or that aspect under the HIV goal, and how, despite the fact that you have many voices influencing the process, you can have these grave errors. And one that came up in the negotiations recently, and it's not finalized because it's at the indicator level, but it was one of the targets about counter-trafficking. And you had all of the trafficking experts, more or less, in the room, advocating that one of the goals should be about reducing the number of trafficked victims. And then we were a very small minority saying, wait a minute, anybody who's worked on counter-trafficking will know that it's easier for governments to pretend that people are, that there's a reduction in actual incidents of trafficking, and to just not extend protection to people who are legitimately trafficked. In other words, you would be doing the opposite of what you're trying to do, right? Extend protections to victims of trafficking by just reporting that there are less people who are in need of that type of protection. Similar problems with the IDPs, obviously, where the whole problem with displaced people has been first acknowledgement that they exist. So, just 15 years of effort shot down by experts around the room saying, well, that's the most obvious thing. Let's just say reduce the number of people, reduce the number of incidents, without understanding what the implications would be.
Okay, listen, why don't we take a few minutes, take 3 minutes break here, and reconvene at 1:15 for our next roundtable session.